All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about is objectives. Now, objectives help teachers determine the goals for both units and lessons. So there is going to be a unit level objective as well as a lesson level objective, at least one of those that you will have for each lesson plan. Writing objectives is a complex process. There is a formula to it, which I will talk about in this PowerPoint, but the idea really is that you sometimes they look pretty simple, but you do need to touch on different things in order to ensure that your lesson plan objectives are going to be measurable and that they're doing exactly what you expect when you're jotting down your ideas for the big goals or the ideas of what you want to accomplish in your lesson plan. Questions to consider: what do you want your students to know and be able to do? What are the skills, concepts, and processes that you are assessing throughout your lesson? So you're going to share your reasons for this lesson in measurable terms that students can understand. So you do want them to be written in a simple way so that students can understand them. And a lot of schools require you to post your objectives somewhere on the board so that students can see what they are expected to do each day. Each objective is geared toward what students should be able to do, and that's that's why you start with students will be able to. So students will be able to, and then you fill in the blank with what they will be able to do. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. So these must be actionable, which means you must have some sort of learning verb that is included within your objective. Our rule of thumb here is that you want to make sure that your objectives are SMART. They must be specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based. And so let's talk about what each one of these letters means in this acronym. So specific, obviously you want your objectives to be specific as to what you want students to be able to accomplish by the end of your lesson. Consider these two objectives. So for example, get in shape versus run 3 times a week. So one is very general, get in shape. It doesn't give me anything actionable to do. It doesn't give me any sort of time frame. It doesn't tell me what to do. Whereas run 3 times a week tells me what I'm going to do. I'm going to run, how often I'm going to do it, and that's 3 times a week. And so it gives us a little bit more to chew on. It gives us something that we can actually do. Which objective is more specific? Obviously, we just talked about that. I always frame my objectives by identifying, like I said already, students will be able to, but sometimes people shorten it up to just be SWBAT, SWBAT. So students will be able to. Again, like I said, it's important for you to say what the students should be able to do by the end of your lesson. So that's what makes it specific. What are they going to do by the end of your lesson? What are they going to be able to do by the end of your unit? They should also be measurable. So you must be able to measure how your objective has been met. So how do you know if you've reached that objective, if you've met that goal? There are several different ways to measure the success of a lesson / student learning. It can be a quiz or a test, but you should mix it up. So these can be like little daily things like an exit ticket. It could be a class conversation. It could be the illustration of an image that students do. It could be a question by asking them what questions do you still have. But really, any of these means are important ways of quick and easy assessment, something that we will talk about later. So the measurable part of writing an objective is what is the assessment you are going to incorporate. If you find that students are not doing well with an assessment, one of two things is happening, right? Either you did not do a good job of teaching the lesson or the assessment did not do a good job of measuring what you taught. So again, when we talk about assessments, we'll go into a little bit more detail here, but you need to determine what's going on when students are not being successful and when what you're measuring isn't turning out to be what you'd hoped for. Again, something that's measurable. The mistake that many young teachers make is that they write an objective that has an action that cannot be measured. Students will learn. Well, I can't climb into a student's brain and determine whether or not they've learned a concept. So you need to make it measurable. That's really the action verb here. How can you measure learning? You can't climb into their brain. So what are the observable things that you can do? Again, that's about being specific. You want to use Bloom's taxonomy as the gold standard, okay? And we'll talk about what that is. There's a hierarchy of student learning and assessment. Remembering is down at the bottom. Creating is typically at the highest. It's also been revised a little bit, so we'll talk about what that hierarchy of. This is the baseline of what students can do, and this is sort of the ceiling of what they can do. It typically looks like this. This is the original, the more traditional version of Bloom's taxonomy that a lot of people will reference. There's a new one where evaluation is at the top and knowledge is at the bottom. What I like about this particular image here is that it gives you both the skills that you want students to be able to do. So the baseline is here is knowledge. So knowing something is essentially similar to being able to memorize. So show me what you learned on a very basic level, versus evaluating being at the top end of that spectrum of saying, so tell me how useful you think this information is that you've learned. And what I also like about this, and so if this is your, if these are your different levels, they give you various learning verbs that you can incorporate within your objectives. And so this is really, really important. If you look at this ratio, if you know that you're focusing on something like comprehension on a day, so like in my lesson plan for The Giver, we know that students are focusing on trying to understand what's happening in chapters 1 and 2. So I might go over here and look at what is some of the languaging that I could put in my lesson plan. Our students will be able to defend, perhaps, why they want to do a particular job. They might be able to explain what it might feel like if you were to be assigned a job, or they might be able to explain the events of chapters 1 and 2. You can see where comprehension is here, whereas perhaps the synthesis of knowledge, like maybe comparing and contrasting what happened in the previous unit with Laurie Halse Anderson's novel Speak, and comparing that to what happened in the novel of The Giver, you might see how students, again, might be able to explain, but on a different level. So this is where you can, this is a wonderful resource, this Bloom's Taxonomy, of looking at your higher order level of thinking, as well as what verbs you can put inside of your objectives. I will make sure to include this within our module as well. So they also must be attainable. So your objectives must be reachable for students, okay? So if you have some sort of goal that is beyond the reach of students, you're just going to frustrate them. But on the flip side, if it's too easy, then it's not also going to be all that engaging for students. So they should be able to be achieved given the restraints of your classroom environment. Before a lesson, you need to think about how you intend on achieving these objectives. What are you going to do? So how is the lesson plan actually going to get students to be able to reach these goals? Consider your starting point and your end point, and what road will get you from point A to point B. And you'll always have limitations. If you have too many limitations for a particular lesson, then your objective is less attainable. So really, this is about knowing your students and what they can reach by the end of a lesson, as well as what they can reach by the end of a unit. The R is realistic. You always need to have your students at the center of your objectives. Consider the skills and backgrounds that are your students are bringing into the classroom, and how realistic it is that you'll be able to achieve what you're hoping to do by the end of that class or by the end of your unit. So again, this is very closely related to that notion of attainability. And then the final one, the T, is timely. Your objective should be grounded in some sort of time frame. So think about how long it will take for you to lose 10 pounds. Again, if we go back to that original example of, wanting to lose weight, tell us how much weight you want to lose. What's the time frame for it? And think about what is reasonable. Again, all of these go back to that attainability element. And so if, for example, we have a running example. Let's say that Fassbender wants to run and train for a 5K race in 3 weeks from today. So we have a time frame. We understand the distance that I'm going to run. What might my objectives look like for my ultimate goal of running a 5K in 3 weeks from today? So overall unit objective could be Fassbender will be able to run a 5K. That's the most basic piece of information. Pretty good. But not the best we can do. Something that's better would be Fassbender will be able to run a 5K 3 weeks from today. Okay, so that has that element of time put into it. But if we want to be even better, we have specific things. Okay, a little bit more specific. Fassbender will be able to run a 5K 3 weeks from today in 30 minutes. And so we have something that I'm directly pointing to, and I will be able to measure whether or not I've been successful by the end of the unit by basically understanding whether or not I reached my goal when I run this 5K in 3 weeks. So then what would a daily lesson objective look like? So what do we have to do on a daily, or in my case, probably more likely a weekly basis, to ensure that I'm prepared to reach my ultimate objective of running a 5K in 3 weeks in 30 minutes. Well, I need to develop a strategic training regimen. So what would week 1 look like? So week 1 might be Fassbender will run 1 mile in 8 minutes. We know that a 5K is 3.11 miles, and so I'm going to break it down into 3 weeks. If I run 1 mile in week 1, I might run 2 miles in week 2, and then my final objective will be to run 3 miles in week 3, but also giving myself that time frame. I know that 1 mile I'll have a little bit of energy, but by the time I get to running 2 miles, maybe I won't be able to keep running at that 8-minute status, and so I'll be realistic with I might be a little bit slower running 2 miles, and then I may be a lot slower in running 3 miles. But having that specific regimen on a daily or weekly basis helps me understand how my daily and weekly objectives then feed into my summative objectives, my unit level objectives. So as we look at the objectives in the sample lesson plan that I provided, students will be able to, on a unit level, identify elements of dystopian literature in The Giver. Students will be able to compare elements of the community in The Giver to modern society. So these are bigger, broader unit level objectives. And then you can see how these unit level objectives feed into my lesson level objectives. So if my unit level is students will be able to identify those elements of dystopian literature in The Giver, on my first day, students will be able to identify the setting and main characters in chapters 1 and 2. So you can see how those are related. And then students will be able to justify their beliefs about the role of personal choice in finding a career. You can see how that is a lesson level goal that feeds into this notion of the elements of the community in The Giver in modern society. And so really you do want your unit level and lesson level to feed into one another, because your lesson level helps you determine whether or not you are meeting those benchmarks that you will expect by the end of your unit. All right, so that's objective writing.